The city smelled like burned concrete and old blood. Mark had been pulling bodies out of the wreckage for 3 hours. Not enemy bodies, civilian ones. The kind with names nobody had logged yet, wallets still in pockets, phones still locked. He'd stopped counting at 32. After that, the numbers stopped, and only the weight mattered: how heavy each person was, how limp, whether they moved when he set them down. A GDA extraction team worked the southeast corner of the block. Flashlights cut through the gray haze. Medics moved fast between the wounded, no wasted motion, the kind of efficiency that came from doing this too many times. Cecil's people. They always showed up exactly when the worst of it was already over. Mark set down a woman with a broken leg and a head wound that had clotted on its own. She was conscious. Better than most. "You're going to be okay," he said. She looked at his suit, yellow and blue cape torn at the hem, and said nothing. Her eyes ran. The math, civilians always ran when they saw him at a scene like this. If he was here, then whatever had happened was the kind of thing that didn't stop happening for years. She wasn't wrong. 3 Viltrumite operatives had worked this block. Not a full assault. A demonstration, which was what Thrag's people had been running for the past 2 months. Pick a city. Break enough of it. Leave before the response arrives. The message stayed the same every time: you cannot protect this planet. And we are not yet serious about destroying it. Mark had arrived in time to drive them off. They'd pulled back the moment he engaged. That was also part of it. They weren't here to fight. They were here to count the cost of not surrendering. 47 confirmed dead. 1 city block. 2 years to rebuild minimum. He stood and scanned what was left of the intersection. A 6-story building had pancaked. A parking structure had folded sideways across the road. Somewhere in the second pile, a gas main was leaking. He could smell it, faint and wrong, threading through everything else. GDA had the perimeter sealed. Sealed and safe were not the same thing, and everyone on site knew it. One of the field technicians flagged a motion alert near the north rubble line. She called it in to her team lead, who passed it up the chain. 3rd sweep of the block, and they were still pulling movement signals from inside the debris. His earpiece crackled. "Grayson." "Cecil," flat as always. "We've got something strange on the north side." Define strange. "That's why I'm calling you instead of just handling it." The north end was where the building had come down hardest. The outer walls had blown outward on impact, throwing debris across 40 meters in every direction. 3 GDA operatives stood at the edge of that, scatter rifles, up, aimed at something sitting on the ground between 2 collapsed sections of flooring. Mark landed 10 feet back. It was small. Round and pink, roughly the size of a large watermelon. It sat upright on 2 short red feet arms, more like round stubs than actual arms resting at its sides. Eyes too large for its face, a flat sky blue. It was scanning the rubble, not panicking, not moving. Just looking, turning its head in short arcs, like it was tracking something beneath the surface. It was the least threatening object Mark had ever seen at a disaster site. "What is that?" he said. "Unknown," Cecil said in his ear. "Appeared on radar 4 minutes ago. Low altitude, no craft, no entry signature. Just dropped." "It dropped and it's just sitting there. Uninjured, as far as we can tell." One of the operative sergeant's markings rifle, still trained on the pink shape, glanced back at Mark. "It hasn't moved since landing. But when Kowalski tried to approach it, turned and tracked him the whole way, didn't look away once." Mark took a step forward. The round pink thing turned its head and fixed those blue eyes on him. They regarded each other for a moment across 6 feet of broken ground. Then its posture shifted. The whole round body tilted, head angling past him, towards something inside the collapsed structure at his back. Whatever had its attention now, it wasn't Mark. It wasn't the rifles. Mark turned. Rubble, dust, a broken support beam, leaning against what used to be a wall. When he turned back, the pink thing had already moved. It crossed to the collapsed wall in one low, fast arc, feet barely touching the ground between bounds. Before any of the operatives could shout, it opened its mouth. Mark had fought his father. He had watched cities come apart. He had taken hits that should have ended him. None of that had prepared him for watching something the size of a small child inhale like that. The sound was wrong, too large for the body making it. A hard pull of air bent the dust into spiraling currents and dragged loose debris skidding across the ground. Two chunks of broken concrete the size of basketballs lifted and disappeared into its mouth. A length of rebar followed. A sheet of twisted metal scraped 6 feet across the ground before the pull cut off. Then it hit the wall. Not with a weapon, with itself. One step back, then forward, and the impact of that small, round body against 4 feet of collapsed, reinforced concrete made a crack Mark felt in his back teeth. A section of wall the width of a doorframe ceased to exist. Ragged whole cloud of gray powder. It went through. Mark went after it. Inside the space was narrow and dark, the kind of pocket that formed when structural debris fell at just the right angle against itself. A woman was trapped there. Mid-40s, her right leg pinned under a beam. Bad enough to hold her, not quite bad enough to have finished her. She'd been screaming. That was what it had heard, Mark realized. Through the wall, through the noise and the distance, and 3 hours of a full rescue operation, running outside, the small pink thing had heard her screaming. It was standing next to her, not touching her, staring at the beam. When Mark came through the hole, it looked at him, then back at the beam. "I've got it," he said. He wasn't sure who he was talking to. He gripped the beam and lifted. The woman dragged herself back on her arms and pulled free. The pink thing tracked her movement, then looked at Mark, then at the exit it had punched open. A low groan from above, weight shifting somewhere in the stack, and a crack split across the ceiling. The pink thing was already facing it when the fragment broke loose. 40 kilograms of concrete dropping fast into the narrow space. Its mouth opened. The chunk went in clean. It turned, aimed at the hole in the wall, and spat. What came out hit like a detonation. No clean shape to it, just a dense mass of force that tore through the already weakened outer wall and blew apart in the open air with a concussive crack. 3 GDA operatives outside went to their knees. Dust and pulverized concrete blasted 20 feet in every direction. Mark stared at the hole, then at the thing. Then at the woman on the floor who was staring at it, somewhere between relief and raw disbelief. "Okay," Mark said. The pink thing looked at him with those wide blue eyes. "Okay," he said again. He didn't have anything else. He carried the woman out. The pink thing followed through the hole it had made back into the open air. The GDA operatives still had their rifles up. Mark set the woman down near the medics and turned back. The round pink shape stood in the middle of the cleared area, turning a slow circle. Taking in the wreckage, the lights, the people in gear pointing weapons at it. It looked at each of them in turn, steady, unhurried, and something about that steadiness made the operatives feel, one by one, very aware of what they were holding. Sergeant Kowalski dropped her barrel 2 inches. Mark's earpiece. "Grayson." "I see it." "What is it?" "I don't know." It heard a woman through a collapsed wall, broke through to her, and cleared the exit. Cecil's pauses always carried more than his sentences. This one meant he was already running data, building a containment plan, accounting for variables Mark hadn't thought of yet. "Keep it calm," Cecil said. "Nobody fires. We don't know what happens when it takes a hit." "What we do know," Mark said, "is that it turned a chunk of ceiling into something that just took out a wall." "Yes. That's exactly why I said keep it calm." At the far edge of the debris field, something moved. A reaniman, one of the older combat units, dead tissue and wire. The kind the GDA had been quietly pulling from service for years, lurched free from behind the folded parking structure. It had been in the rubble since the initial collapse pinned. Now it was out. It oriented toward the medics and the cluster of wounded at the triage point and started moving. It made 4 steps. The pink thing was no longer in the middle of the open area. It hit the reaniman from the side with everything it had, and the sound of that impact was short and total. The kind of sound that meant something had stopped all at once. The reaniman's head connected with the asphalt, and it did not get up. The pink thing landed 2 feet away. It looked at what it had just put down, then at the medics, then at Mark. Its expression was simple in the way that uncomplicated things are simple, not unreadable, just plain. Something had needed to stop. It was stopped. It was ready for whatever came next. Mark heard Cecil. "Grayson." "Yeah. Don't provoke it." "Wasn't planning to." A longer pause. Then, "From now on, everything about that thing goes through me." The GDA forensics team arrived 20 minutes after the reaniman stopped moving. 3 vehicles unmarked. They fanned out without talking, documented the hole in the collapsed wall, documented the scatter pattern, documented the downed reaniman from 5 angles before the containment unit moved in. Standard protocol applied to a non-standard situation. Nobody told them what had done it. The pink thing sat on a slab of broken concrete near the triage point and watched the medics work. It had been there for 11 minutes. Mark had counted. It hadn't moved toward the wounded, hadn't made any sound, hadn't done anything that could be read as aggressive. It just sat upright on those short red feet and tracked the movement of the carts and the people carrying them with those wide eyes. Every time a cot went past, every time someone groaned or shifted, its attention followed. Mark stood 12 feet away and tried to decide what he was looking at. He crouched down to roughly its eye level, which felt slightly ridiculous, given that it came up to about his knee. Up close, the roundness of it was even more pronounced. No real neck, no division between head and body, just one continuous pink curve, interrupted by a face and 2 arm stubs and those short red feet. "I'm Mark," he said. It blinked, both eyes slow. Its gaze shifted past him. A medic was taping a compress over a child's forearm on a nearby cot. It held that direction for several seconds, then turned back to Mark, stayed there, stopped scanning. Mark filed that away. Cecil arrived in a GDA transport at the 40-minute mark, which meant he'd been watching the whole thing on a live feed and had taken 39 minutes to decide how he wanted to walk in. He came out of the vehicle, straightening his jacket, swept the sight fixed on the small pink shape on the concrete slab, and walked toward Mark without varying his pace. "Has it done anything since the reaniman?" he said. "Watched the medics. Didn't move. Eaten anything?" "No, although..." Mark stopped. "Although what?" "One of the field medics dropped a ration pack near it about 20 minutes ago, accidentally." She picked it up again. He paused. It watched her do that pretty carefully. Cecil studied it for a long moment. It returned the attention with the same level regard it gave everything else, no wariness, no aggression, just the focused presence of something that was paying attention. "It understands cause and effect," Cecil said. "That's one way to put it." "Is there another way?" Mark didn't answer that. Cecil turned and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through something. "I'm moving it to Site 4. Soft containment, no restraints, no hostile stimulus. Clean space food, basic environmental conditions. We observe, we don't poke. And if it doesn't want to go, then we find out what happens when it doesn't want to go, which is information I'd rather gather in a controlled environment than in the middle of a triage operation. He glanced at Mark. You're coming. Obviously. Santander. Site 4 was a GDA secondary facility 40 minutes outside the city. The interior had been reconfigured fast, fresh cable runs still taped to the floor. Temporary lighting rigs bolted at wrong angles, equipment shoved to one side rather than stored. Someone had cleared a wide space and set up a table near the center, with water and several trays of food. The food selection had the logic of a panic decision. Everything from protein bars to canned fruit to what appeared to be an entire cooked chicken because nobody knew what it ate and nobody wanted to guess wrong. The pink thing came in through the door Mark held open and stopped. It took in the room. The food table. The two-way glass along the far wall where the shapes of people and equipment were visible as silhouettes. Then it walked to the food table and ate everything on it, all of it, in approximately 90 seconds, including things that Mark was fairly certain were not meant to be eaten in combination. The trays were empty before the last of the GDA personnel had finished filing into the observation corridor. Mark stared at the empty table. "Huh," he said. From somewhere behind the two-way glass, he heard someone typing very fast. "Caloric intake to body mass ratio is not physically coherent," said Robot. His voice came through the observation corridor speaker into the main space, not loudly, just present. Mark had been expecting him. Robot was already here when they arrived, which meant Cecil had called him before Mark. "What does that mean in practice?" Mark said. "It means the quantity consumed should not fit inside a body that's a size based on any known biological model. Either it has significant internal spatial variance relative to its exterior dimensions, or it metabolizes at a rate that renders standard intake calculations meaningless." A brief pause. Possibly both. The pink thing had finished eating and was now investigating the water container. It tipped it, watched the water pour, and appeared to find this interesting. "It's curious," Mark said. "It demonstrates exploratory behavior in a non-threatening environment. That's not the same as curiosity necessarily." Robot. "Yes. It's curious." A short silence. "The behavioral profile is consistent with high-functioning, problem-solving cognition and environmental mapping. It is gathering information about this space." Mark watched it set the water container upright again and turn its attention to the two-way glass. Directly at it. "It knows you're there," Mark said. "Yes," Robot said. "It knew approximately 4 minutes ago. It has been deciding whether to react. And it has decided not to, which is its own form of data." Cecil came into the main space an hour later, alone. The small round shape was sitting in the middle of the floor, apparently doing nothing. Which Mark had come to understand was not actually nothing. It was listening or sensing or processing something that didn't show on its surface. It turned when Cecil entered and tracked him across the room. Cecil stopped 8 feet away. "We're going to need to agree on some ground rules," he said, even though it demonstrably did not speak English and had given no indication it understood any language. Cecil said it anyway, in the measured tone of someone who was establishing the record. "It stays here voluntarily. We don't restrain it. We provide food, water, environmental stability." He looked at it. "In exchange, it doesn't level the building." It held his gaze. "I know you don't understand that," Cecil said, "but I said it." He turned and walked back to the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Grayson." "Yeah." "You're on overnight. Don't get attached. The door closed behind him. Mark turned back. It was watching the door Cecil had just walked through. Then it shifted to Mark. Just that one thing to the next, no readable expression in between. "He's not as bad as he sounds," Mark said. Those wide eyes stayed on him. He didn't have anything to add to that, so he didn't. The facility ran quiet after midnight. The observation team cycled down to 2 people. The lights in the main space dimmed to a low operational level. Mark had found a chair and dragged it inside rather than watching from behind the glass, which had generated a brief argument with Cecil over comms that had ended with Cecil saying, "Your funeral," and cutting the line. It did not sleep. Or if it did, it slept sitting upright with its eyes open, which was indistinguishable from being awake. Sometime around 2 in the morning, it got up and walked to the wall on the far side of the space, the one that backed up against the older section of the facility, the part that wasn't part of the reconfigured area. It stood there, put one small round hand against the concrete. Mark sat forward. "Hey." It didn't turn. "Hey, what is it?" It stayed very still, hand against the wall. Its head had tilted slightly, the same tilt it had done in the rubble right before it moved on the collapsed structure. The same posture Mark now recognized as the thing it did when it was listening to something he couldn't hear. He stood up and walked to the wall, put his own hand on it, felt nothing except concrete, cold, faint vibration from the HVAC system. "I don't hear anything," he said. No response. It was fixed on the wall with those wide eyes, and whatever it was perceiving through the concrete, it had gone very still, in the way it only went still when something had its complete and undivided attention. Mark keyed his earpiece. "Cecil." No answer. 2 in the morning. "Cecil, something's... I heard you the first time." Cecil's voice alert, not even slightly groggy. "What is it doing?" Standing at the east wall, not moving. Same posture it had before it went through the collapse site. A pause. "That wall backs up against the C-Wing access corridor," Cecil said. "What's in C-Wing?" A longer pause. The kind that was not a communication lag. Under Mark's palm, the concrete felt the same. Cold. Faint HVAC hum. Nothing. But the small, round shape beside him had pressed its hand flatter against the surface like it was trying to get closer to whatever was on the other side. "Grayson?" "What's in C-Wing, Cecil?" "That's not your concern right now. Step back from the wall." The line clicked off. Mark stood at the wall and watched it. Still pressed against the concrete, head tilted, listening to something deep in the building that he could not hear and Cecil was not going to tell him about. It did not move again that night. But it did not move away from the wall either. Morning came to Site 4 without fanfare. The overhead lights shifted from their dim operational setting to something brighter and more institutional. And that was the extent of it. No windows, no natural light. No way to tell the difference between 5 in the morning and noon, except by the clock mounted near the observation corridor and the shift rotation cycling through it. Mark had slept 2 hours in the chair, maybe 3. He'd stopped checking the time somewhere around 4. It had not moved from the east wall. He'd watched it through the early hours, sitting upright, hand pressed against the concrete head at that slight tilt, and at some point, exhaustion had pulled him under despite himself. When he woke, the pink figure was in exactly the same position. He stood up, worked the stiffness out of his shoulder, and crossed the space. "Hey." No reaction. He stopped 2 feet away. Up close, the stillness was more pronounced than it read from across the room, not the stillness of sleep. The stillness of a held breath of something that had found a frequency and was running it on loop, filtering out everything else. He put his hand on the wall again, Same result as before, cold concrete, the faint mechanical pulse of climate systems, nothing else. I still don't hear anything, he said. It didn't respond to that either, but one of its wide eyes shifted, not turning, just moving in the socket in his direction, registering his presence, then back to the surface. Mark dropped his hand and stepped back. Cecil arrived at 6:43. Mark knew the time because he'd started checking again. 2 GDA technicians came in ahead of him, set up equipment along the observation side partition without speaking, and left. Cecil came through the main door with a tablet and did not look at Mark first. His eyes went to the compact pink figure pressed against the east barrier. "How long?" he said. "Since around 2. It found the wall, put its hand on it, and hasn't moved." Cecil tapped something on the tablet. "Temperature stable. Respiration unchanged. No indicators of distress." "Indicators of distress," Mark said. "That's a phrase. It's a data point." "Cecil." Mark kept his voice low. "What's in C-Wing?" Cecil scrolled through something. "Ongoing research operations." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have for you right now." Mark looked at the east barrier, then at Cecil. "When Kirby does that," he gestured at the small figure, "it's not just sitting there. In the rubble yesterday, it did the same thing right before it punched through and pulled out a woman who was trapped. It hears something we can't. And right now, it has been pressed against that concrete for 4 hours." Cecil put the tablet down on a folding table and turned to face him fully. "Grayson, Site 4 is a containment and research facility. Some of what we contain requires procedures that are uncomfortable to observe. That is not new. It is not going to change. And it is not subject to review because an unknown alien organism has fixated on the east side of this building." "Uncomfortable to observe?" Mark said. "Yes." The silence between them had weight. "Okay," Mark said. "Okay." Cecil picked the tablet back up. "I need you to step back from the wall, both of you, if you can manage it." Mark didn't move. "What happens if I can't manage it?" Cecil's expression didn't shift. It never did. "Then, we find out." What happened was that Mark didn't get the chance to find out anything. At 6:51, it took its hand off the east barrier. It turned. Fixed on the main door, the one Cecil had come through, the one connecting to the interior corridor. Then on Mark. Then down at the floor, and Mark had the distinct and unsettling impression that it was calculating something. Then it inhaled. Not the full pull, not the one that had dragged rebar across a disaster site. Something shorter, more directed, but still wrong. The papers on Cecil's folding table didn't just lift, they tore free and slapped against the far partition. A cable running along the baseboard snapped its clips and whipped sideways. A GDA technician in the observation corridor stumbled, one hand going to the wall. The air in the room moved toward the figure and was gone. The door at the far end of the observation corridor, the one leading to C-Wing, locked, bolted, rated for several things Mark didn't want to think about, buckled inward 2 inches with a sound like a gunshot. "Containment," Cecil said into his radio. Flat, immediate. Then a half-second later, with the particular tone of someone recalibrating, "All personnel away from C-Wing access now." The small shape was already moving. Mark went through this door fast, half a second behind it. The corridor beyond was narrow and white overhead lights buzzing at a frequency he could feel in the back of his skull. A security team was already coming from the far end, 3 people, body armor, non-lethal in front, and they stopped when they saw what was between them and Mark. All 3 weapons came up. One of them said something under his breath that wasn't a radio call. Another stepped back without meaning to wait, shifting before training, caught up with instinct. The third held steady, but her trigger finger was doing something wrong. It hit the security door at the midpoint of the corridor like a thrown object. The door was steel-framed in concrete, sealed with a magnetic lock rated for several thousand pounds of force. It held for approximately 1 second before the frame cracked and the door swung inward the wrong way. Hinges stripped the whole assembly, folded flat against the corridor side. The 3 security personnel did not advance. One of them backed up. Mark held up a hand. "Don't shoot. Nobody fires. Let me." It was already through. He followed. C-Wing was 3 rooms behind that door. Mark went through 2 of them, fast, standard equipment storage shelving units shoved aside in the wake of it moving through, and stopped at the entrance to the 3rd. He wished he hadn't looked. The room was cold. Deliberately cold, the kind of temperature-controlled environment that existed to preserve samples or slow metabolic processes. It had 6 stations, along one side each, with a fixed restraint frame and instrumentation he recognized from surgical contexts, and some he didn't. 4 of the stations were empty. The 5th held something that had been at some point a living creature, roughly humanoid, not human, patched with sensor leads and tubing in a way that said this had been going on for a long time. It was breathing, shallowly, but breathing. The 6th station had a chair overturned in a hurry. A technician was pressed into the far corner, hands up. A second had made it to a side exit and was gone. The small round shape stood in the center of the room. It was looking at the creature in the 5th frame. Mark said nothing. There was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said. The creature in the frame made a sound low, not quite a vocalization, more like a frequency adjustment, and the small round shape moved to it. Not fast. Carefully. It put one small hand on the frame, not on the creature. It looked at the restraints. It looked at the sensor leads. It looked at the technician against the wall with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was the complete and total absence of any uncertainty about what was happening here. The technician dropped to the floor and crawled for the exit. Mark let him go. The restraints came off fast. Not torn, it didn't tear them, but fast. One hand on the frame, one motion per lock, no hesitation between them. Like it had understood the mechanism the moment it touched it and was now just executing. No pause to examine, no recalibration. Just this, then this, then this. Mark had expected it to take longer. It didn't take long at all. When the last lead pulled free, the creature in the frame slumped against the side rail. Still breathing. Still alive, just no longer held. The alarm had been going for 4 minutes. Red emergency lighting had replaced the cold white overhead. Somewhere deeper in the facility, Mark heard boots on metal flooring, heard radio traffic punching back and forth, heard Cecil's voice cutting through it, flat and precise. "Seal C-Wing, do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." Mark stood in the doorway and didn't engage. The small round shape stayed next to the released creature. It wasn't touching it. It was just present. Between it and the door. Between it and everything on the other side of the door. "Hey," Mark said quietly. It looked at him. "I'm not going to take it back in there," he said. "Okay, I'm not doing that." It held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the creature in the frame. Mark exhaled. It took Cecil 40 minutes to get the situation to a state he could call stable. The research wing was evacuated. The creature which was alive, which remained alive, which Mark was going to have very strong feelings about later, was moved to a medical bay that had not been built for this purpose, but was the best option currently available. The small round shape followed it there and sat down outside the door. It did not move from that position for the rest of the day. Mark found Cecil in the facility's main operations room, standing in front of a monitor bank, watching feeds from 4 cameras. One of them showed the small round shape outside the medical bay. One showed the creature inside. 2 showed the structural damage in C-Wing that was going to require significant explanation. "How many of those stations were occupied before today?" Mark said. Cecil didn't answer right away. He watched the monitor. Then, 4. What happened to the other 3? Research concluded. The words sat in the air like something physical. Research concluded, Mark said. Cecil started to say something. Don't. Mark turned toward the exit. I'm going to go sit outside the medical bay. Don't call me back in here until you have something worth saying. He was gone before Cecil finished the sentence he'd already abandoned. At the far end of the facility, a monitoring node running on Alan's intelligence network flagged an anomalous data burst from inside Site 4. Localized power surge, security cascade, a thermal bloom from a room that had been cold for months. The flag was low confidence, not enough to escalate, not yet. But it was logged, and someone somewhere would eventually read it. The facility ran a full shift the next morning. That was the official position. Operationally normal. Incidents under review. Personnel at stations. In practice, everyone moved like they were carrying something they hadn't been told the weight of yet. Mark noticed it in small ways. The technician who took 3 seconds too long to badge through a door he'd used 100 times. The 2 analysts in the corridor who stopped talking when he walked past, then started again too fast. The way the cafeteria, which normally ran at low noise, was instead running at almost no noise. People eating with their heads down, not looking at the east side of the building. Nobody looked at the east side of the building. He got coffee, stood at the edge of the room, and thought about what it meant that a facility full of people trained to handle extreme situations was currently being visibly unsettled by a round pink shape sitting quietly outside a medical bay door. It was still there when he checked at 6, still there at 8. At 9:47, a GDA logistics coordinator named Pharaoh came down the corridor with a cart and a polite expression and the clear intention of moving the subject from the medical bay to a more secure holding arrangement. She made it to about 15 feet from the door before she stopped. The round pink shape was sitting directly in front of the bay entrance. It wasn't blocking it. It wasn't doing anything threatening. It was just sitting there, upright, on those short red feet. And it had turned to face Pharaoh the moment she came around the corner, and it was looking at her with those wide blue eyes in a way that made polite logistical movement feel like a category that no longer applied to the situation. Pharaoh stood there for a moment. Then she turned the cart around and left. Mark, who had been watching from the far end of the corridor, said nothing. He filed it under the same category as the technician at the door and the analysts in the cafeteria, and the fact that Cecil had not yet come to him directly this morning, which meant Cecil was either managing something larger than Mark, or managing the fact that he didn't want to have the conversation that was coming. Probably both. And then Cecil found him at 11, not in the corridor. In the operations room where Mark had been standing in front of the same monitor bank Cecil had used the night before, looking at the same feeds. The one showing the bay entrance. The one showing the subject inside, still alive, still breathing, currently asleep, or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. The subject has been assessed, Cecil said. It's stable, non-communicative, no immediate threat profile. Haas, that's a relief, Mark said. I'm going to need you to help me manage the next 48 hours. What happens in 48 hours? Ideally, nothing. But I need the variable in medical bay corridor to remain calm. The variable Mark said. You mean Kirby? I mean the entity that breached a secured research wing and removed a contained subject from an active protocol. I know what I mean. Cecil held the pause the way he held most things, briefly, precisely, with full awareness of what was in it. What I need from you is simple. Stay close. Keep it stable. Don't let it go deeper into the facility. And in exchange, the subject stays in medical. No relocation. No resumption of protocol. Mark looked at him. That's not a favor. That's just the minimum. Yes, Cecil said. It is. And I'm telling you, it's what you're getting so you understand the situation clearly. The thing about Cecil was that he always meant exactly what he said. No subtext. No softening. Which meant the minimum was the minimum, and there was nothing under it except worse options that he'd already decided Mark didn't need to know about yet. What happened to the other 3 subjects? Mark said. Before the one in medical. Cecil's expression didn't change. That's not relevant to the next 48 hours. I think it might be. Grayson. Not a warning exactly. More like a door being closed. Do you want the subject in medical to stay in medical, or do you want to have a different conversation? The silence had edges. Fine, Mark said. I'll stay close. Cecil nodded once and left. Mark stood there for a moment after the door closed, looking at the monitor showing the corridor outside the bay. The round pink shape was still there, hadn't moved in 3 hours, just sitting patient, in the way that things with no agenda are patient, not waiting for anything specific, just present. He went back to the corridor and sat down on the floor 6 feet away from it. It looked at him, then back at the bay door. Yeah, Mark said. Me too. Robot's assessment came through the operations terminal at 2 in the afternoon, flagged for Mark's attention by a routing protocol that had apparently been set up without his knowledge. He read it standing up. It was 12 pages. He skimmed the first 8, which were data physiological readings, energy output calculations, cross-referenced incident analyses from the collapse site and the C-wing breach, and read the last 4 slowly because those were the part that mattered. The entity's response threshold is consistent and replicable. Targeted suffering deliberate harm with a human actor as the cause triggers engagement. Random casualties, collateral damage, environmental hazards, no significant response. The distinction is not about scale. It is about intent. Threat assessment standard deterrence does not apply. It cannot be dissuaded by force projection. It can be activated by any system that uses directed suffering as an operational tool, interrogation research protocol, or warfare doctrine. Strategic note. The Viltrumite Empire's documented pacification methodology is coercive at every stage. I am not recommending a course of action. I am documenting what I observed. Mark put the tablet down on the operations desk. He stood there for a while. Then he picked it up again and read the last paragraph one more time because he wanted to be sure he had understood it correctly. He had. He went to find Robot. You wrote this, Mark said, and then you wrote, I'm not recommending a course of action. Correct. You just described Kirby like it's a tool you point at the right problem. I described a behavioral pattern. What you do with that description is not my decision. That's not... He stopped. The thing was, Robot wasn't wrong, and that was the part that made it worse. That's not what it is. What it is, Madame, Robot said, is a being that tears through whatever is causing the most suffering in its immediate environment. The reason it does that may matter to you. it does not change the outcome. The reason is the whole point. To you. A pause. Cecil will reach the same operational conclusion within 6 hours, regardless of how I framed the assessment. I sent it to you first. Mark didn't answer that immediately. It wasn't generosity, not from Robot, not exactly, but it was something. A heads up. The closest thing to consideration the situation was going to offer him. And Thrag, he said. Has Cecil thought about what happens when Thrag reads the same report? That scene, Robot said, is why I wrote it. Yak. The signal that left Site 4 at 4:18 p.m. was a scheduled redundancy transmission, automated routine, the kind of thing that ran without anyone signing off on it. It was supposed to carry sanitized facility logs. The sanitization protocol had been manually disabled 6 weeks ago during a system update and never re-enabled. Not sabotage. Just the particular kind of neglect that built up in organizations managing too many things at once. The transmission reached 4 nodes. 3 were domestic GDA. The 4th was an observation platform that tracked Viltrumite activity and shared data with a coalition that predated Mark's involvement by about 15 years. At 5:02 p.m. Allen read it. He read it twice. Then he pulled up the raw archive and went through the event data himself, because he had learned a long time ago not to trust automated summaries when the confidence rating was above 80%. The confidence rating on this one was 93. He sat with it for a few minutes. Outside the platform's viewport, the outer solar system turned slowly against the dark. He thought about the last time he'd talked to Mark. Thought about the state of the war. Thought about Thrag's documented strategic methodology, which he had read in full 3 times, and which contained exactly one consistent principle. Identify, leverage, apply it, increase until resistance collapses. He thought about what it would mean for Thrag to learn that there was something on Earth that responded to suffering the way a compass responded to magnetic north. Then he composed a message, encrypted, point to point, to Nolan Grayson. We need to talk, not over this channel. Soon. He sent it and sat back and watched the dark outside the viewport, and thought that this was probably the part where things got worse before they had any chance of getting better. He was not wrong. The platform ran on a skeleton crew between rotations. 3 personnel rotating 8-hour watches, enough to maintain the monitoring systems and respond to anything that required a human judgment call. Allen had been stationed here for 11 days on a longer assignment that had nothing to do with Earth. He was running the Earth archive when Nolan's response came through. Not the reply he'd sent last night. A different channel. Tighter encryption. The kind Nolan used when he didn't want the message's existence to be provable. Seen it. Where are you? Allen replied with coordinates. 20 minutes later, Nolan was there, not through a door, just through the viewport, decelerating from deep space to a dead stop with a kind of casual precision that still registered as wrong to Allen's sense of physics, even after years of working with Viltrumites. He came in through the airlock. Didn't say anything right away. Walked to the data terminal, stood there, and read. Allen let him read. It's consistent, Nolan said after a while. Yeah. Not a fluke. Not a territorial reaction. It responds to deliberate suffering the same way every time. 93% confidence on the pattern match. I ran it myself after the automated flag. Nolan straightened up from the terminal. He had the expression Allen had learned to read over 2 years of working adjacent to him. The one that looked like nothing was happening on the surface and meant something heavy was being turned over underneath. The collapse site, he said. The research wing. 2 data points. Both clean. No ambiguity in the trigger. Someone was being hurt on purpose. It went through whatever was in the way. And it stopped when the threat stopped. Correct. Personnel who ran it let go. Personnel who kept going, it put down. Nolan moved away from the terminal and stood at the viewport. The outer solar system was a slow spread of dark and distant light. He looked at it for a while without speaking. "The Viltrum method," he said finally. "The whole playbook. You take a planet, you identify the population centers, you pick the most visible people, and you make an example of them. You keep going until the will to resist collapses. Every stage of that process involves deliberate, targeted suffering as the primary tool." "Yeah? So you see what this means?" Alan looked at the terminal. He'd been running the same numbers for most of the past 14 hours. "It means every standard stage of pacification, the ones that use civilian casualties as pressure, would set it off. Every single one. The whole Viltrumite playbook is built on exactly the thing that makes this entity respond." "Not gradually," Nolan said. "Not over weeks. Every stage of pacification that uses civilian harm as pressure, which is all of them, would set it off. Immediately, repeatedly, at every point of escalation. Thrag doesn't know that yet. No." Nolan turned from the viewport. "But someone will tell him." The medical wing at Site 4 smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the specific tension of a space that had been reorganized too fast for a purpose it wasn't built for. Mark had been coming here 3 or 4 times a day. Not for long. Just to check. The subject he still didn't have a word for it that felt right, so he'd stopped trying, was stable. Awake sometimes. Not responsive in any way that translated to language, but alive. Clearly, undeniably alive, and no longer attached to anything it hadn't chosen to be attached to. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then went back out to the corridor. The pink shape was exactly where it had been. Same position it had taken after following the subject here. It shifted to track him when he came out, then settled again when he sat down a few feet away. One of the medical technicians, the one who'd been assigned overnight, a young guy named Drescher, came down the corridor with a cart of supplies and slowed when he saw the setup. Him on the floor. The round pink shape at the door. He'd been doing this for 3 days, and Drescher hesitated every single time, like his nervous system couldn't quite finish deciding what category it had landed in. He made it to the door, started to maneuver the cart past. His elbow caught the edge of the frame. The cart lurched. One of the bags on the bottom rack tipped and hit the floor, and the impact made a sound, and the sound made the subject inside shift, and the shift made a noise. The pink shape was already turned. Not standing, not moving forward. Just turned completely and immediately facing the source. Those wide eyes fixed on Drescher with an attention that wasn't aggression, but was so absolute that Drescher went still the way prey goes still. 3 seconds. Drescher very carefully picked up the bag, very carefully set it back on the rack, moved through the door with the same precise deliberateness of someone diffusing something. The pink shape turned back to face forward. Mark let out a breath. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's about right." Cecil had been in the operations room for most of the day, running damage control on 3 simultaneous tracks. Track 1, the C-Wing incident report, which needed to describe what had happened without describing what had happened in any way that could be used against GDA by anyone with legal standing or journalism contact. Track 2, the subject in medical, which was stable and alive and currently functioning as evidence of a program. Cecil was now deeply motivated to ensure no one, in any official capacity, was able to document clearly. Track 3, the transmission gap. His security team had found the disabled sanitization protocol at 6 a.m. He'd spent the next 4 hours tracing where the unsanitized archive had gone. domestic nodes all recoverable. The fourth node. The Coalition platform was not domestic, not under GDA authority, and not responding to his requests for data return, which meant someone outside his jurisdiction had the archive. He didn't know who yet. He had guesses. None of them were comfortable. His radio crackled. "Director, Grayson is in the corridor again." "Understood." "Should we?" "No," Cecil said. "Leave it." He went back to the transmission trace and kept working. Dusk. "How long before Thrag finds out?" Alan said. Neither of them had moved. Nolan had not left. Alan had not called it done. There was coffee at some point, and neither of them really drank it. "There are 17 confirmed Viltrumite agents operating in civilian monitoring roles across the Coalition network," Nolan said. "I don't know which ones have access to the Coalition's shared data layer. At least 4 do. So, anywhere between now and weeks, maybe, if we're lucky. Less if any of the 4 were watching the right feed at the right time." Alan turned the coffee cup in his hands. "What does Thrag do when he knows?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet Alan had come to associate with Nolan, sorting through things he didn't want to say out loud, because saying them made them more real. "He won't try to kill it first," Nolan said. "That's not how he thinks. Killing it first only works if killing it is fast and certain. And nothing about what happened in that facility suggests fast or certain. So he runs a test. He sends a small force. He doesn't tell them to kill the subject. He tells them to generate the conditions that produce a response, and he watches what he gets." Alan stared at his coffee. "He uses civilians. He uses the city, the people in it. Because if the response is as consistent as the data says, if you can predict exactly what will set it off, then you can predict exactly what it will do. And once you can predict what it will do, you can plan around it. Or use it. Or use it," Nolan agreed. His voice had flattened out. "That's what I would have done 3 years ago. Look at a pattern like this and think, here's a variable I can work with." Alan didn't say anything. "The difference between me then and Thrag now," Nolan said, "is that I stopped. He won't." The encrypted response from Nolan's message took 9 hours to reach a relay station, 6 light minutes past Jupiter. From there, it bounced to a secondary node that existed on no GDA registry, then to a third that didn't have a permanent location. It moved slowly on a schedule that changed every 72 hours. At the third node, a Viltrumite communications officer with 17 years of service in Empire intelligence pulled the intercept. She didn't read it. She wasn't cleared to read encrypted traffic from that relay pair. She logged it, flagged it by source, and forwarded it to the office of the Grand Regent marked priority. It would sit in queue for 4 hours before anyone opened it. But it would be opened. 3 days after the C-Wing breach, Cecil moved Kirby's operating radius from Site 4 to a temporary field post 12 kilometers outside the city. The official reason was logistical. The real reason was that a round pink shape sitting outside a medical bay was the kind of thing that made GDA personnel file informal reports, and informal reports had a way of becoming formal ones. The field post was a converted emergency management station, a low building, a wide perimeter, a chain-link fence that would stop exactly nothing. Mark had a cot in a back room. Kirby slept outside or didn't sleep, which amounted to the same thing. The subject from C-Wing had been transferred to a proper medical facility under a different classification, alive, non-communicative, still the thing Mark didn't have a word for, and Kirby had watched the transport vehicle go until it turned out of sight, then settled into position near the post's east wall, like it was completing a circuit. Mark didn't ask what it was listening for. He'd stopped asking questions that didn't have answerable answers. So, on the fourth morning, he woke up to Cecil's voice on the radio. "We have incoming. 3 confirmed, possibly 4. Target area is the Ardell District Resettlement Zone." Mark was already reaching for his suit jacket. Viltrumites. Flight signatures match. They came in low, probably suborbital drop. Not from a ship we've tracked. What are they doing? Nothing yet. That's the problem. He pulled the jacket on and went outside. The sky was gray and flat and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The field post was quiet. Kirby was by the east wall, and it had already turned away from the wall and was facing north toward the city with the same locked posture it used when it was receiving something Mark couldn't. "You already know," Mark said. It didn't respond. It was watching the horizon. He launched. And the Ardell District had been a resettlement zone for 8 months, which meant it had temporary housing half-constructed infrastructure, and a population that was still working out how to be a community again after the last time something large had decided to move through it. About 42,000 people, most of them in the middle of a weekday morning. Mark reached the outer edge of the zone and found it intact. Quiet streets, people moving laundry lines, a food distribution cart on the corner of what used to be a main road. He did a fast pass at altitude and saw nothing, and for about 6 seconds, he thought maybe Cecil's signature analysis had been wrong. Then the eastern block went down. Not an explosion, not a structural failure. A Viltrumite drove into an intersection out of a vertical drop and cracked the road in a 20-meter radius. The buildings on either side lurched. The food cart went over. A woman pushing a stroller lost her grip, and the stroller rolled toward the crater's edge and stopped. She was screaming before the dust cleared. 3 people near the impact point were on the ground and not moving the way people moved when they'd chosen to get low. 2 more dropped from the north. They split without communicating, one angling toward the distribution center, one into the housing blocks. They moved like they had a map and were running ahead of schedule. Mark had 1 second to decide which direction to go. He went for the stroller. First kid was unhurt. Mother had a cut across her forearm, and by the time he'd cleared them, the nearest Viltrumite was already 30 meters out and accelerating toward a crowd that hadn't started running yet. He caught her at the corner. The Viltrumite he caught was female, broad-shouldered, with a specific kind of calm on her face that came from doing violence professionally for a very long time. She absorbed his tackle, rotated, drove him into a concrete retaining wall with enough force to leave a mark-shaped impression, and stepped back. She didn't follow up. Her eyes went to him, swept the intersection, then lifted to the sky, looking for something. "Where is it?" she said. Mark extracted himself from the wall. "Where's what?" She drove an elbow into his sternum. While he was dealing with that, she said something into a comms piece, short-clipped. Whatever she was waiting for hadn't arrived yet. Something crossed Mark's peripheral vision from above. Moving fast, no flight trail, no warning. Something hit her from above. Not a person, not a projectile. A pink shape moving at a speed that had nothing to do with its size came out of a vertical drop and made contact with the top of her skull, with the full concentrated mass of its body. The sound it produced was the kind that ended arguments about structural limits. She went into the ground face first and didn't move. Mark looked at the crater she was in, then at the small pink shape standing at the edge of it, slightly dusty, watching her with those wide blue eyes. "How did you get here that fast?" he said. It turned and looked north. The second Viltrumite had made it to the distribution center and was in the process of destroying it systematically, not because he needed to, but because the screaming it produced was measurable, and that was the point. He heard the sound from the intersection. He turned. The pink thing was 100 meters away and closing. He'd read the briefing. The footage from the Site 4 archive had tagged it as medium-tier negligible mass, no visible weapon system breach of a reinforced door, probably an anomaly. Approach with standard caution. He revised that assessment approximately 1 second before impact. It didn't come at him straight. It hit the ground. 10 meters out, bounced off the concrete at a shallow angle that redirected its entire kinetic load and caught him across the lower rib cage from the side with a hit that felt like being struck by a vehicle. The air went out of him. He skidded across the plaza, hit a support pillar, felt 3 ribs go. He got up. He was Viltrumite. 3 ribs were inconvenient. What came next was not a continuation of the first hit. It was a different attack pattern entirely. The round pink body had relocated somewhere else, moving, bouncing off the pillar behind him at an angle he hadn't tracked, and the second impact caught him across the side of the head and rang something very deep in his vestibular system. He put a hand on the ground to stay upright. The pink thing landed between him and the distribution center. It was facing him. It wasn't breathing hard. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went up. And the third Viltrumite had been in the housing blocks for 90 seconds when the first 2 made their retrieval signals, and she pulled back on schedule because the mission parameters were observation and confirmation, not attrition. She'd collected enough. The response had been immediate. The trajectory and force output matched the Site 4 data with an acceptable variance. She took one last reading as she climbed. Below, the figure stood in the plaza and watched her go. It made no attempt to pursue at altitude. It simply tracked her ascent, those enormous eyes following the line of her flight until she was too far up to read expression. She noted that in her report. Subject demonstrates target prioritization. Non-pursuit of retreating combatants confirmed. Response threshold consistent with prior data. Deliberate harm to non-combatants triggers immediate engagement. Recommend this variable is controllable. The trigger is predictable. Further testing advised. She reached the extraction point and was gone. Mark landed next to it in the plaza. The distribution center was wrecked, but standing. The 2 Viltrumites who'd taken direct hits were gone, pulled out by the one who'd retreated before he could reach them. The intersection to the east was going to need significant reconstruction. 19 people had injuries ranging from minor to serious. 4 were critical. The 3 from the initial impact zone had not gotten up. And the medics working them were not moving with the speed of people who still thought that was likely. He turned to it. It was watching the sky. They pulled back, he said. All 3 of them. It didn't react to that. They got what they came for, he said. His earpiece, Grayson. Cecil, flat and immediate. The retrieval signals we caught, those were data burst transmissions, compressed short range. They sent a package before they left. I figured. Whatever they recorded, it's already off planet. Mark looked at the sky. Somewhere above the cloud layer, something was moving. With the information it had come to collect, he thought about what Robot had written, about what Nolan had said, about the particular logic of a war run by someone who identified leverage, applied it, and increased until resistance collapsed. Beside him, it finally looked away from the sky. It turned to the distribution center and the people gathering around it, and began moving toward them, back to the work of pulling people out of wreckage. Mark watched it for a moment. Then he followed. The dead from Ardell were 3. 2 men and a woman, all near the first impact point, none of whom had a realistic chance from the moment the Viltrumite feet hit the road. The critical cases were 4. The injured were 19. The numbers came through Cecil's line while Mark was still standing in the plaza, watching the round pink shape move through the wreckage with the same patient efficiency it had brought to every collapsed structure he'd seen it work through since day one. It didn't know about the 3. It had no framework for that kind of accounting. It just moved toward wherever someone needed to be moved, tilting its head when it found a live one, adjusting direction when it found the opposite. Mark watched it work and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the situation hadn't already made obvious. He found Cecil on a secure line 40 minutes later, standing at the edge of the cordon district with dust on his suit and someone else's blood on his left sleeve from carrying a man out of what was left of the distribution center's outer wall. 3 confirmed, he said. I have the number, Cecil said. They targeted the densest population area, came in at the exact time of highest foot traffic. They were counting on the distribution center being full. Yes. That's not a military strike. That's an experiment. Also, yes. Mark kept his voice even. It took effort. They used 42,000 people as a measuring instrument. They used 3 of them as one, Cecil said. The other 41,997 were collateral leverage. There's a difference, and the difference matters for how we respond. How do we respond? Cecil went quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant type. The pause of someone who had already run through the options and was deciding which one to hand over. We move Kirby's position. We don't stay static. We make the next test harder to run, and we start thinking about what the test results mean for their next move. That's not... Mark stopped. Cecil, 3 people are dead because a Viltrumite strike force used the pink thing as a target dummy. And you're talking about positioning. I'm talking about not letting it happen again, Cecil said, which requires positioning. He paused. Grayson, I know you're angry. Be angry later. Right now, I need you to think. Mark looked at the plaza. The pink shape had found someone under a section of collapsed awning, a teenager from the look of the legs visible, and was working the debris free with the same methodical focus it applied to everything. Not fast. Careful. He turned away from it. Fine, he said. Talk. Robot's proposal came through 3 hours later, formatted as an operational planning document with 5 sections and 11 subsections, and a conclusion that Mark read 4 times because he kept hoping he'd misunderstood it. He hadn't. The core of it was simple. Kirby's response pattern was consistent enough to be modeled. The trigger conditions were predictable, given that Viltrum was already factoring those conditions into their operational planning. The most efficient defensive posture was to preemptively position civilian population density in ways that would maximize the probability of Kirby engaging at locations where GDA response infrastructure was also positioned. In plain language, arrange the pieces of the board so that when Viltrum tried to use civilians as bait, the bait was in the right place. Mark called Robot directly. You want to use people as bait, he said. The same way Viltrum does. You're just planning it in advance. I want to reduce civilian casualties by ensuring Kirby's response occurs where support is already present, Robot said. His voice carried no inflection that suggested he found the distinction uncomfortable. The alternative is reactive deployment, which means Kirby responds where it happens to be, not where infrastructure can assist. The alternative is not doing this. The alternative, Mamdum, Robot said, is accepting that the pattern will be exploited repeatedly and doing nothing to shape the exploitation. I'm suggesting we shape it. You're suggesting we treat people like variables in an optimization problem. I'm suggesting we treat a war like a war. Mark reached for something that would end the conversation with him being right. He couldn't find it, not without also being wrong about something else, which was the particular anger that Robot always produced in him. The logic wasn't entirely wrong. It just pointed somewhere he didn't want to go. "Send it to Cecil," he said. "I need to think." "It's already with Cecil," Robot said. "He asked me to send it to you first." Mark stared at the wall for a moment. "Of course he did," he said, and cut the line. The pink shape came back to the field post at dusk. Mark was sitting outside on the low concrete barrier that served as the post's only perimeter feature, watching the light go flat over the city skyline. Not particularly thinking about anything he wanted to be thinking about. It settled near him. Not close. 6 or 7 feet, the same radius it seemed to maintain by default around him specifically. He studied it. It had dust in its feed folds, and something darker along one side that he didn't want to examine too closely. It had been working the district for 6 hours. It had not eaten. It showed no signs of injury or depletion that he could read. "Do you know what they're planning?" he said. It fixed on the horizon. "Cecil's going to move you around like a chess piece. Robot already has the board drawn up." He exhaled. "And I don't have a good argument against it that also keeps people from dying, which is the part I keep getting stuck on." The horizon didn't offer anything useful. The round pink shape didn't either. But it turned toward him briefly before settling back to looking forward. And whatever that motion meant, if it meant anything, Mark filed it in the same category as the way it had made space for the teenager's legs at Ardell, and the way it had stayed outside the medical bay for 3 days, and the way it had let the running technician go in C-Wing. It knew where the harm was. It didn't need the board drawn up. The Viltrumite officer who filed the Ardell assessment was thorough. Her report reached Thrag's command 3 hours after extraction. 2 of the 3 adjutants who reviewed it flagged it as high priority. The 3rd had been with the Empire long enough to see what it meant without the flag. Response consistent. Trigger confirmed. Pattern holds across multiple engagement types. Variable is not random. Variable is not controllable by conventional means, but is consistent enough to be factored. Recommendation: scale the test. Single district is insufficient sample. Require multi-point simultaneous engagement to determine if response can be split or degraded under parallel load. Thrag did not read the report himself. He had someone read him the conclusion. He asked one question. "How many points?" The answer was 4. Minimum. He approved it without comment and moved to his next item. The Empire had run this calculation on 47 planets. It had a process for dealing with variables that didn't respond to force projection. That process had never failed. It had also never encountered a variable quite like this one. But that Thrag had decided was a reason to be thorough, not cautious. The briefing took 11 minutes. Robot ran it. Cecil listened without interrupting, which Mark had learned to read as a sign that Cecil already knew most of it and was using the briefing to establish shared record rather than learn anything new. The map on the operations screen showed 4 districts. 3 were resettlement zones. 1 was a water treatment corridor serving roughly 80,000 people downstream. 4 simultaneous, Mark said. They approved 4 points. Based on the Ardell data, Robot said. The working hypothesis is that a single response vector can be split or degraded under parallel load. They're testing whether the pattern holds at scale. When? The pattern suggests within 72 hours of the Ardell extraction. That window opens in 9 hours. Mark studied the map. 4 points, spread across the northern sector like someone had placed them with a ruler, each one far enough from the others that no single response could cover 2 simultaneously. They're not here to destroy anything. They're running a stress test on a reflex. Yes. And your proposal is to pre-position around the reflex. My proposal is to reduce the time between trigger and support arrival by modeling the most probable response trajectory. Stop. Mark turned from the map. I understood it the first time. I just want you to hear yourself say it out loud, in a room where someone can tell you what it actually is. Robot said nothing for a moment. What it actually is, he said finally, is the difference between 40 dead and 4. The number sat in the room. Mark didn't have a clean answer to it. He hadn't had one since the first time Robot had run the calculation, and the calculation hadn't changed. Mark turned from the map. 9 hours. Get me everything we have on those 4 districts. Signed. The first strike came in at hour 7. Not at any of the 4 marked districts. A Viltrumite unit hit a transit hub 8 kilometers south of the modeled zone, fast and hard in and out before Mark was airborne. 11 injured. 3 dead before the medics reached them. The unit was gone before the GDA response vehicles arrived. Mark landed in the wreckage of the hub's main waiting area and stood there for a moment, looking at what remained of the information boards and the rows of seats and the vending unit that had somehow survived intact. And he thought they changed the playbook. His earpiece Cecil. The 4-point model was a decoy analysis. You're reading the same scene I am. The real pattern is reactive drag. They're not testing simultaneous load. They're testing how far from position they can pull the reaction before the actual strike lands. Where's the actual strike? We don't know yet. We're watching all 8 of the secondary nodes. Mark was already in the air. The round pink shape was not where he'd left it. He found out because one of the secondary nodes lit up a residential block in the Marin district 3 kilometers east, and when he reached the outer edge of the zone, he could already see the damage from altitude. 2 structures down. A gas line blown from what looked like deliberate impact on a junction box. The street below full of people running in directions that made geometric sense if you were trying to maximize confusion and minimize clear evacuation paths. In the center of it, moving through the gas cloud and the smoke and the crowd, with a speed that made it look like the rest of the scene was in slow motion, was a round pink shape about 20 centimeters tall, doing work that should have required twice as many people and 4 times as much equipment. Mark came down fast. A Viltrumite, one male mid-size by Viltromite standards, was positioned at the far end of the block, not attacking. Observing. Logging, probably. He saw Mark coming and moved to intercept. They hit each other at the same speed, and it went badly for both of them for about 30 seconds, which, in a Mark Grayson fight, was a long time. The Viltrumite was good. Not exceptional, not the caliber of the Ardell team, but trained, methodical, and very specifically not trying to win quickly. He was trying to hold position long enough for something else to happen. Mark took a hit across the jaw, got his hand around the man's collar, drove him into the pavement at an angle that cracked the concrete, and probably 3 of his own metacarpals, and raised his head. The gas line had been lit. Someone, or something, had ignited the cloud. The residential block was on fire. What came next was not a combat sequence. It was a rescue sequence with combat happening inside it, which was worse in every way. The round pink shape inhaled the real version, the one that bent light and pulled loose debris in spirals, and took enough fuel from the burning side of the block to drop the flame from critical to manageable in roughly 4 seconds. It was not elegant. 3 windows blew out from the pressure differential. A section of exterior wall sheeted off in a direction nobody had been standing. But the fire dropped, and the people on the upper floors who had been on the wrong side of it were still alive. And that was the accounting that mattered. Mark cleared the Viltromite down, Not dead, pulled up and thrown into a wall hard enough to stay there for a minute, and started pulling people out of the ground floor units that had taken the structural hit. The round pink shape was already on the second floor doing something through a wall that produced a sound like a hydraulic press in reverse, and resulted in a load-bearing element going back to roughly the position it had been in before the strike. At some point in the next 12 minutes, the Viltrumite recovered and left. Mark didn't stop him. He was carrying a woman out of what used to be her kitchen. Cecil in his ear. Third node is hot. Westfield corridor. Looks like a feint within a feint. The transit hub was bait for the 4-point model. Marin was bait for the transit response, and Westfield is... I know what Westfield is, Mark said. He set the woman down outside the building's collapse radius, made sure she was upright and moving, and scanned the sky. It's where they want the pink thing to go next. Yes. He fixed on the round pink shape, which had come back to street level and was now orienting. He could see it, the tilt of the whole round body to one side, reading something distant and terrible in the direction of Westfield. Don't. Not loudly, just clearly. It turned to him. I know there are people. But if you go there, they get a third data point. They'll have the full pattern. They'll know exactly how to run the next one. It held his gaze for a long moment. Then it faced Westfield, then back to him. He was already moving. I'll go, right now. You stay and finish this block. It didn't move. He was in the air before it could process whatever it processed when it made decisions. Westfield was a distribution corridor food, water, medical for the Southwestern Resettlement Network. Hitting it didn't kill anyone directly. It just cut off supply lines to about 30,000 people who were already living close to margin. Mark arrived to find 2 Viltrumites in the process of methodically dismantling the junction infrastructure. Not fighting, not even looking for a fight, just working systematically like they had a checklist. He hit them both, and it went about as well as hitting 2 professionals who weren't trying to win a fight went. They absorbed, they deflected, they stayed on task when possible, and defended when necessary. One of them said calmly between a block and a counterstrike, "We expected you to send the other one." Mark drove his elbow into that one's nose hard enough to feel the crunch through his sleeve. "You expected wrong." "Did we?" He surveyed the junction infrastructure. Most of it was already gone. "Does it matter?" The Viltrumite said. "Where the reaction lands, if the result is the same either way." Mark hit him again. He went down. The second one pulled back, not fleeing, repositioning, and Mark let him go, because there was equipment to pull out of the rubble and a distribution network to assess, and 30,000 people who needed a supply line by morning. He stood in the wrecked corridor and took stock of what remained salvageable. And he thought about what the Viltrumite had said. And he hated that it was a real question. Cecil's debrief was brief and very precise. The transit hub was designed to pull us to the wrong analytical position. Marin was designed to draw engagement into a logged strike zone. Westfield was the actual objective infrastructure, not casualties, because infrastructure damage compounds over time. And every step of it, Mark said, was also a Kirby observation run. Correct. They have 3 data points now. Movement speed across terrain types, response prioritization under time pressure, behavior when redirected by a known ally. That last one. Yes. They know I can pull it off a target. They appear to have anticipated that you would try. The question is whether they factor that into a future engagement as a vulnerability or a tool. He thought about Kirby finishing the Marin block while he was at Westfield, about the people who'd been on the second floor, about the supply corridor that was going to take 2 weeks to rebuild. Mark stared at the middle distance. They're going to try to use me to direct it. Cecil didn't answer right away. Cecil? It's a reasonable operational assumption, Cecil said, that they will attempt to exploit every available lever. Mark stared at his earpiece for a moment, like he could stare through it into whatever room Cecil was currently sitting in. That's not what I asked. I know, Cecil said. Get some rest. The line went quiet. 11 days after Ardell. 6 active incident zones in the past 72 hours. 4 of them triggered in the same 12-hour window, which was either a coincidence or the clearest possible statement of intent. It was not a coincidence. Mark had stopped sleeping in complete stretches. He caught 2 hours here, 40 minutes there. And by the morning of the 11th day, he had developed the particular clarity of someone who has been running on nothing for so long, that the depletion stopped feeling like anything and started feeling like baseline. He was standing in the wreckage of a water recycling plant in what used to be the Eastern Industrial Corridor when Cecil's voice came through his earpiece. Fen Heights, residential. They're burning the evacuation staging area. Boss, Mark was airborne before the sentence finished. Boss, Fen Heights was 8 kilometers north. He got there in under a minute and found it already mid-collapse, a 6-block residential cluster with a staging zone that had been, until approximately 4 minutes ago, processing about 3,000 people through evacuation. 2 Viltrumite operatives had come in from the east, targeted the coordination tent and the vehicle access points, and were in the process of preventing organized movement out of the zone. Not killing everyone, collapsing the system that was moving everyone. Mark hit the first one and drove her into the road. The second one moved to engage, and he split his attention badly. A mistake in any fight against anything Viltrumite level, and he knew it the moment he made it, and took an elbow across the temple that made the next 4 seconds mostly light and sound. He got back on his feet. The second operative was already in the air, pulling back, not retreating, repositioning, probably with a log of exactly how long it had taken Mark to recover from a solid hit to the head, which was useful data if you were running a warfare experiment. He let them both go. There were 3,000 people still inside the perimeter. The round pink shape arrived 11 minutes into the rescue sequence. Mark had been tracking it with his earpiece. Cecil had the position feeds kept giving him updates in the flat voice that meant he was running multiple channels simultaneously and not making eye contact with anyone. And the last position had been 6 kilometers south, a commercial district where a gas line rupture had trapped workers in a basement level. 11 minutes, 6 kilometers with a stop at a structural collapse in between. It came in from the south end of the staging zone and did not slow down to assess. It had already assessed, apparently, from whatever distance it ran its assessments from. It went into the worst section of the collapse, the coordination tent, which had taken a direct structural hit and had people trapped under it, and started working with the same focused efficiency that Mark had stopped trying to find a frame of reference for. 3 minutes into the rescue sequence, it paused. Not stopped, not frozen. Paused the way it had been pausing more frequently in the past week, head tilting attention, pulling in a direction that wasn't the immediate problem in front of it. Like something at the edge of its range had just registered. Then it went back to the tent. Mark watched it and kept moving and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. He'd started noticing the pauses 4 days ago. They were getting longer. He found the failure at the zone's south entrance. A section of the evacuation route had collapsed not from a strike from a gas main rupture triggered by the structural damage from the initial impact. About 60 meters of road had dropped 2 feet, and the access ramp that connected the residential cluster to the main evacuation corridor had buckled in a way that made it impassable for anything slower than a person on foot. The vehicles that had been loading people hadn't been able to leave. The vehicles that were supposed to arrive hadn't been able to enter. 47 people had been in those vehicles or waiting to board them when the strikes hit. Most had managed to get out on foot when the ramp failed. 11 had not. 3 of those 11 were in critical condition by the time the medical team reached them through an alternate route. The other 8 were not in any condition at all. Mark stood at the edge of the collapsed ramp and looked at the numbers in the report and understood with the specific precision of someone who had been running on 2 hours of sleep and too much adrenaline exactly what had happened. The strike hadn't targeted the ramp. The strike had targeted the coordination tent, knowing that the coordination tent failure would cascade into the access routes, knowing that a gas line ran under that section, knowing that the combination would produce exactly this outcome. Not a weapon aimed at people. A weapon aimed at the system, keeping people alive. He found a quiet corner of the staging zone perimeter and called Nolan. No preamble. "They're not fighting us. They're editing the conditions." Nolan picked that up immediately. Yes. Every strike for the past 2 weeks has been about producing a specific cascade. They're not trying to win engagements. They're trying to demonstrate that the ground-level response is a closed loop they can operate. Also, yes. A pause. "How long before you and I say the obvious thing?" "Which obvious thing?" "That you cannot win a war by responding to every consequence the other side manufactures. At some point, you have to target the manufacturing." Mark stared at the buckled ramp. 8 people. Not because anyone had aimed at them, but because the system that was supposed to protect them had been precisely disrupted. "Cecil's already thinking it," Mark said. "Robot has a model for it. They just haven't said it to me out loud yet because they know what I'll say." "What will you say?" "I'll say that targeting the manufacturing means going after Viltrumite infrastructure directly. It means going offensive. It means Kirby stops being a response tool and starts being a weapon pointed at something. And I need a better argument against it than I currently have, or I need to stop arguing." Nolan was quiet for a long moment. "There isn't a better argument. There's just a question of who makes the choice and under what terms." That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be. The round pink shape found him at the perimeter 20 minutes later. It had finished with the tent. The people who could be gotten out had been gotten out. The numbers on that end were better than they should have been, which was the specific kind of arithmetic that kept Mark from going entirely sideways. The rescue sequences worked. Individual interventions worked. Kirby was extraordinarily effective at the immediate level. The immediate level was no longer sufficient. It settled near him at the perimeter and looked south the same direction it had tilted toward during the rescue sequence. Mark didn't know what was south. Probably another incident. There was always another incident. "I know," he said. It didn't respond. That had stopped being unusual. "We have to change what we're doing." He said it quietly, more to himself than to it. "I don't know yet what that looks like. But staying in this pattern means every good thing you do gets absorbed and processed and used to produce the next reason to make you do it again." The round pink shape was still fixed on the horizon in that direction. Then very deliberately, it turned and looked at him. Not a glance, not a passing orientation. It turned toward him and held on him with those wide blue eyes for long enough that he had to resist the impulse to say something that would fill the silence. He didn't fill it. After a moment, it turned back toward whatever it had been tracking. And then instead of launching into another rescue sequence, it sat down. It just sat there. At the edge of a collapsed evacuation zone among the last of the rescue vehicles, in the particular quiet that came after a crisis had processed itself into aftermath. Mark sat down next to it. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." "Anang," He called Cecil from the perimeter while the sky was going gray. We need to talk about what we're actually doing. Not positioning, not response optimization. What we're doing. I've been waiting for this call for 6 days, Cecil said. I know you have. The conversation is going to involve things you won't like. I know that too. And you're ready to have it anyway. Mark watched the round pink shape sitting at the edge of the zone, still oriented toward whatever it had been hearing, still tracking across distances he couldn't measure. No, he said. But I'm having it. The conversation with Cecil lasted 40 minutes and covered territory that Mark had been avoiding for 2 weeks. By the end of it, he was standing at the window of the field post, looking at the city's skyline and trying to decide whether what he felt was clarity or just a very specific flavor of losing. You're not wrong, he said. I know. And I still don't like it. You don't have to like it. You have to decide whether you're doing it. Mark looked at the skyline. Somewhere out there, in one of the remaining resettlement clusters, it was doing what it always did at this hour. Sitting at an outer perimeter, reading distances, waiting for a frequency that meant someone needed pulling out of something. In a few hours, that frequency would come. The sequence would run, and at some point in the next 48 hours, another coordination tent would go down, another gas line would rupture on schedule, and the machinery would produce another round of casualties to feed back into the loop. When Robot identified the relay stations, Mark said, was that what he was building toward? The whole time, Robot has been building toward an offensive framework since the 3rd section of his analysis. He was waiting for you to be ready to hear it. That's annoying. Yes. Okay, Mark said. Pull up the relay map. Robot's relay map was not complicated. It was elegant in the particular way that things were elegant when the person building them didn't care at all about aesthetics and only cared about function. The Viltrumite coordination network for the ongoing test campaign had 4 primary relay nodes, communication hubs that linked the strike teams on the ground with the data processing layer, above which then fed to the command architecture that decided when, where, and how hard to push. Knock out 1 relay and the network degraded. Knock out 2 and the test campaign lost its ability to coordinate in real time. Knock out 3 and the whole structure became reactive rather than proactive. Knock out all 4 simultaneously, and you didn't just interrupt one campaign. You reset the operational tempo entirely. The problem Asabatum, Robot said, is that simultaneous 4-point interdiction requires a response vector moving at a speed and across a range that no conventional GDA asset can achieve. I know what the problem is, Mark said. That's why we're having this conversation. The entity's documented movement speed across documented terrain types indicates this is achievable within a 4-minute window. The constraint is motivation. Motivation, Mark said flatly. The entity responds to proximate suffering. It does not to date have a documented precedent for targeting abstract infrastructure in the absence of an immediate human victim. Getting it to move toward a relay node requires either placing a victim near the node or stop. Mark set down the tablet with the relay map. I'm not putting people near relay nodes to get it to go there. I know, Sanan, Robot said. Which is why the alternative approach is to convince it through a different mechanism. Mark waited. Show it the machine. Don't explain it. Show it. And he found the round pink shape at the south perimeter of the resettlement cluster at 0300, sitting in its usual position, reading its usual frequencies. He sat down next to it. I need to show you something. It turned toward him and held still. Not a person. Not somewhere someone is hurting right now. Something else. He exhaled. I don't know if you'll understand it, but I think you might, because I've been watching you for weeks. And I think you understand more than you let on. It regarded him with those wide eyes. The things that have been coming here, he said, the ones you've been hitting. They're not making decisions on their own. There's a system that tells them where to go. And as long as the system runs, it's going to keep sending them. It's going to keep making it so there are people to pull out of rubble because that's how the system operates. It produces the rubble so that people like you and me stay busy pulling people out of it. He looked at the city. I need to show you the machine. It was very still. Then it stood up. Nolan met them at the edge of the district an hour before dawn. He'd come down from orbit, no announcement, just the particular pressure wave of a Viltrumite deceleration that Mark had learned to recognize. And he stood in the pre-dawn gray, looking at the small pink figure for a long moment. Alan confirmed the relay positions last night, he said. 2 of them are defended. The other 2 are in positions that suggest they haven't anticipated a direct approach. How defended? Mark said. 4 Viltrumites at Node 1, 3 at Node 2. The others have standard infrastructure security drones, sensors, automated deterrent. He paused. Against most things, that's sufficient. He watched it. Against this, he said, it's a formality. Mark watched it take Nolan in, not with wariness, but with the focused attention it used when it was assessing something new. Do you understand what we're asking? Mark said to it. It turned to him. 4 places, he said, all at once. The people hurting right now in the resettlement clusters. The reason there are people hurting right now, it comes from those 4 places. If those 4 places stop working, the machine stops being able to coordinate. It can't plan the next test. It can't send the next strike team to the next coordination tent. He stopped. He was aware of how much he was asking it to take on faith that the logic was sound. Faith that he'd read the situation correctly. Faith that this was actually the source and not just another layer of it. I could be wrong, he said. But I think this is the place. The round pink shape regarded him for a long moment. Then it turned to Nolan. Then it fixed on the horizon toward the pre-dawn dark where 4 coordinates sat in a map it had no way to access. It tilted its head. Then it inhaled. What followed was not a combat operation in any conventional sense. It was closer to a force of nature running a route. Node 3 went first, the least defended a relay cluster built into the upper structure of a defunct communications tower 12 kilometers northeast. The round pink shape covered the distance in under 2 minutes, hit the tower structure at the base. With enough concentrated force to crack the foundation at the load-bearing point, then inhaled the debris that came down and converted it into 3 consecutive star-pattern projectiles that tore through the relay hardware on the upper platforms in a sequence that took 11 seconds. The signal from Node 3 cut out. Node 4 was 7 kilometers west. By the time the automated deterrent system registered an incoming target, it was already inside the engagement radius. Drones scrambled. The round pink shape rotated through the formation in a tight spiral that used the drone's own collision avoidance programming against them. They moved to avoid it, impacted each other, and the formation broke. The relay core was unhoused, and then it was not. Nodes 1 and 2 were defended. Mark took 1. The 4 Viltrumites there were good, not exceptional. Not Thrag. Not even close, but trained and fast, and very specifically not expecting to be hit by a human Viltrumite hybrid, with 2 weeks of accumulated fury about how his planet was being used as a petri dish. He put all 4 down in under 4 minutes, which cost him a broken orbital socket and 3 cracked ribs and he destroyed the relay core personally with his bare hands because it felt like the right way to do it. Node 2 was its third stop. The 3 Viltrumites there got more warning than the others, about 30 seconds enough to form up and get ready. One of them had apparently reviewed the Site 4 footage and knew what a direct approach looked like. He moved to intercept with a weapon, improvised from the relay tower's own infrastructure bracing. It inhaled the weapon out of his grip at range, swallowed it, and was inside the formation before the other 2 had processed what had happened. One of them made it to the air. The other 2 did not have that option anymore. The Viltrumite who'd improvised the weapon was face down in the equipment housing, and it was standing on the relay core. It stood over the core for a moment. Then it sat on it. The core did not survive this. The signal dropout across all 4 nodes registered in Viltrumite command at 0447. It took 11 minutes for anyone to understand what had happened. Another 6 to confirm it wasn't a technical failure. By the time the full picture assembled, the coordination network for the Earth test campaign was offline, the strike teams on the ground had lost their uplink, and the data pipeline that had been running for 2 weeks was severed at every transmission point. Mark landed at the edge of a resettlement cluster and sat down on a piece of broken wall. His orbital socket was going to be a problem for a few hours. His ribs were manageable. He held his earpiece for a moment, then put it in. "Cecil, I have the feeds. Did it work?" "The network is dark. The teams on the ground are still there, but they're operating blind. Without the coordination layer, they can't run a synchronized test campaign." A pause. "They'll rebuild it. Different nodes, different architecture. It'll take time." "How much time?" "Weeks. Maybe more if we can find the secondary nodes." Mark looked at the resettlement cluster. Lights on in some of the temporary structures, people moving. No smoke, no strike pattern. Just a city's worth of people doing what people did when someone had at least temporarily removed the machinery that was grinding them. The round pink shape landed next to him a few minutes later. It was dusty. A piece of relay hardware was still lodged in one of its footfolds. It shook that loose, then settled. It faced the cluster. Mark watched it watching. Mark looked at the cluster. "Yeah." Nolan reached Alan on a tight beam channel at 0523. "They'll escalate," Alan said. "Yes." "How fast?" "That depends on how long it takes Thrag to decide he's done running tests and wants answers." A pause. "You think he'll come himself?" "I think when the test campaign fails and the coordinator network goes dark and the same variable that's been producing anomalous results for 3 weeks is now demonstrably capable of hitting his infrastructure directly." Nolan stopped. "I think that's the point where Thrag stops reading the reports and starts writing them." "When?" Nolan looked at the data Alan had transmitted. The relay outage, the mission reports, the behavior pattern that had held consistent across every engagement, from a collapsed building in a disaster zone to a coordinated 4-point infrastructure strike. Soon. The network had been dark for 6 days. 6 days without a coordinated test strike. 6 days without a synchronized multi-point pattern. The resettlement clusters ran their evacuations, patched their infrastructure, counted their dead, and began the very cautious process of believing the worst of it might be over. Mark did not believe the worst of it was over. Neither did Cecil. Neither did Nolan. Neither did Alan, who had been pulling double watches on the Coalition platform and sleeping in 2-hour blocks that were starting to show on his face, even through a compression feed. "They're not rebuilding the relay network," Robot said. "They've abandoned the architecture entirely." "That's good. It means they've stopped running the test campaign. It also means the test campaign is complete." Mark looked at the operations display. 6 days of incident logs, all of them local and manageable. Nothing with the signature of a coordinated strike. Quiet that felt like indrawn breath. They learned what they needed. Yes. The question now is what they intend to do with it. Don't. The answer came in 2 stages. The first stage arrived at 02:11 the following morning. Not a strike, not a coordination pattern, but a single Viltrumite who descended into the city's northern industrial sector at subsonic speed and landed in the middle of an empty lot and stood there. One soldier, no visible support, making no attempt at concealment. Cecil had him on feed within 4 minutes. Mark was airborne within 6. The Viltromite was waiting for him. That was obvious from the moment Mark came in at altitude. The man was standing in the center of the lot arms, loose face forward with the specific posture of someone who had been told exactly who was coming and had decided to let them come. He held out a folded data chip as Mark landed. "From the Grand Regent," he said. He believes a direct communication is more efficient than continued indirect engagement. Mark took the chip. The Viltrumite went back up without another word. The chip contained 11 minutes of content. Mark watched it twice. Then he called Cecil and Nolan and Robot onto the same channel and played it through again. Thrag spoke the way he did everything without excess. The message ran 4 minutes and covered 5 points each, delivered with the particular calm of someone who had made decisions before they spoke and was now simply reporting them. Point 1. The test campaign had confirmed the response variable's behavioral parameters to within acceptable confidence margins. Point 2. The response variable represented an unacceptable strategic liability to Viltrumite operational doctrine, regardless of which planetary faction held proximity to it. Point 3. The Grand Regent had reviewed the tactical assessments and determined that indirect management of the variable was no longer an efficient use of resources. Point 4. Thrag would arrive within 48 hours to address the situation personally. Point 5. Any GDA personnel or affiliated assets present at the point of engagement would be treated as hostile combatants. The message ended. The channel was quiet for a long moment. "He's telling us where he's going to be," Nolan said. "He's giving us time to evacuate civilians." "He's giving himself time to arrive," Robot said. "He's also telling us the test phase is over. He's not interested in more data. He's interested in resolution." Resolution. That's the word he'd use. Nolan's voice was flat and careful. He's fought things like this before. Things that didn't respond to standard pacification. He has a methodology for it. A pause. His methodology is thorough. "How thorough?" Cecil said. "He doesn't stop until he's certain." The 48 hours were not quiet hours. They were the kind of hours that moved faster than they should and left less time for everything than you planned, and Mark spent most of them doing things that felt like preparation, but were really a way of not standing still long enough to think about what he was actually preparing for. He supervised 3 evacuation waves in the districts where the previous test strikes had hit hardest. He had a conversation with Cecil that was difficult and brief, and ended with them understanding each other in a way they hadn't managed before, not because they agreed, but because they'd both stopped pretending there was a more comfortable version of this available. He had a shorter conversation with Nolan. "You're going to be there," Nolan said. "Yes." "You understand what Thrag is?" "Yes." "And the other one? You understand what it might need to do?" Mark was quiet for a moment. The field post perimeter was dark. Somewhere nearby, the small pink figure was in its usual position, reading its usual distances, probably already aware of something Mark couldn't measure yet. "I've been watching it for weeks," Mark said. I know what it does when it thinks something is hurting people. I know what it does when it thinks it can stop that. That's not what I asked. I know, he exhaled. I think it'll do what it does. I think it always does what it does. I'm not going to try to control it. Good, Nolan said. Trying to control it is how you get in its way. Certes, Thrag arrived at hour 46. Not from above, from the east, at low altitude, moving at a pace that was unhurried in the particular way that things were unhurried when speed was not a concern, because speed was not the point. Mark was at the edge of the cleared district when he came in. Nolan was 30 meters back. The round pink figure was further back still near a structure that had been emptied 3 days ago as part of the evacuation wave, sitting at its usual patient rest. Thrag landed 40 meters out. He was larger than the video assessments had suggested, not taller exactly, but denser, with the proportions of something built for a specific purpose over a very long time. He wore no armor. He looked at Mark, then at Nolan, then at the small figure near the structure for a long and careful moment. I read the reports, he said. I wanted to see it. Mark didn't move from where he'd landed. Now you've seen it. Yes. His attention moved back to Mark. The behavioral data is consistent with what my analyst described. It responds to suffering. It protects. It does not seek conflict. No, it doesn't. But it responds to those who cause it. He tilted his head a slight motion, almost analytical. I cause it routinely. Every planet we've taken, every population we've shaped. By the logic of what I've read, it would respond to me indefinitely. That's an accurate description of the situation. Thrag looked at him the way generals looked at terrain. Your planet is not a strategic priority worth the cost of an indefinite engagement. A single high-confidence elimination of the variable is more efficient. And if the variable is harder to eliminate than the model suggests, Mark said, you've committed to an indefinite engagement anyway. For the first time, something in Thrag's expression acknowledged that as a real point. That's why I came personally. Then he moved. Ta-ta. What followed was the kind of fight that Invincible verse battles were, at their best, fast, brutal, and honest about the costs. Thrag was not like the test units. He was not like anything that had come before. He hit Mark in the first exchange with the force of someone who had done this 10,000 times and understood exactly what a Viltrumite hybrid endurance looked like and had already calculated where the limits were. Mark went down hard. Got up. Went down again. Nolan intercepted not to win. He knew better than that, but to buy time to disrupt the rhythm, to introduce enough variables into Thrag's calculation that something else could operate. The small pink figure was no longer near the structure. Thrag noticed the absence approximately 2 seconds before it became relevant. It came from below through the foundation of the cleared district, using drill at full depth, punching upward through asphalt and substrate at an angle that placed the exit point directly beneath Thrag's stance. The impact velocity was not the primary mechanism. The primary mechanism was the inhale that followed immediately a full capacity pull that stripped the ground-level air and created a pressure differential that disrupted Thrag's spatial orientation for exactly the half-second required. He recovered in that half-second because he was Thrag. But the half-second was gone. Mark had used the half-second. Thrag took the hit, staggered, which was not something his file suggested happened, and came back with everything he had. And what he had was enormous, and the next 4 minutes were the worst 4 minutes of Mark's life in a career that contained some genuinely terrible minutes. But the small pink figure was still moving. It didn't fight Thrag head-on. It wasn't built for that, and it didn't try. It worked the angles, the inhale, to disrupt the projectile, to redirect the drill, to emerge from unexpected vectors, the hammer that connected once solidly and made even Thrag acknowledge the contact. Thrag was learning. He adapted between exchanges in the way only truly dangerous combatants adapted. He started tracking the pressure differentials. He started anticipating the drill vectors. But the figure also kept learning. Every exchange fed into the next. Every adaptation Thrag made produced a gap that hadn't existed in the previous pattern. The fight did not resolve in 4 minutes or 10. It resolved when Thrag attempted to end it definitively, a sustained assault that was meant to overwhelm both targets simultaneously, and the small pink figure chose the moment of maximum commitment to change scale entirely. The crash ability was not something Mark had seen before, not really, not at full deployment. What happened was not easily describable in terms of individual impacts or measurable energy output. What happened was that the district's atmosphere underwent a rapid and extremely localized rearrangement, and Thrag was at the center of it. And when the rearrangement finished, Thrag was no longer capable of continuing the fight. He was alive. Badly injured in ways that a lesser physiology would not survive, but alive. Mark landed next to him. The Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire looked at him from the rubble he was partly embedded in, and his expression was not the expression of a man who had been beaten. It was the expression of a man who had completed an assessment. "The variable," he said with considerable effort, "is not a variable. No, it's not. It has a consistent moral logic that your side has not exploited and mine has not been able to exploit." "That's right." Thrag was quiet for a moment, breathing carefully. "The Empire does not operate on moral logic." "I know. This engagement will not be the final one." "I know that too," Mark said. "But you came personally, and now the Empire knows what personal engagement costs." Thrag looked at the sky for a long moment, then at the small pink figure which was sitting at the edge of the rubble, completely unmarked, watching him with those blue eyes that contained nothing except the simple certainty of something that understood where the harm was and would always go toward it. "Tell your analysts," Mark said quietly, "that the variable is not for sale, not for redirection, and not interested in empire building. It's just going to keep doing what it does. And what it does is stop the things you depend on." He pulled out his earpiece. "Cecil, can you get a containment team to the northern sector? A live stable needs medical." Thrag said nothing more, but he didn't object to the medical team when they arrived. The GDA field assessment of Thrag's injuries came back with numbers that should not have left anyone alive. Cecil read the report in its entirety and then set it down and did not say anything for a long time, which was its own kind of statement. The Empire did not pull back after Thrag's medical extraction. What they did instead was consolidate. The scattered test units, the relay infrastructure rebuilding teams, the advanced positioning of the second-tier strike assets, all of it collapsed inward in the 12 hours following Thrag's medical extraction. Not a retreat, a contraction. The kind of tactical movement that preceded something much larger and much more committed. Alan called it correctly. They were regrouping around a single authorized objective. "When he's able to move," Nolan said, "he's coming back, not with teams, not with test protocols." "How long?" Mark said. "Weeks, maybe?" Viltrumite biology works faster than human medicine. And when he comes back, he comes with the full weight of the decision behind him. Last time was Thrag making an assessment. Next time is Thrag making an end. Mark looked at the city. 3 weeks of damage still visible in the skyline. The gap where the distribution corridor had been the construction scaffolding on 2 resettlement blocks. The memorial markers that had gone up in the Ardell intersection and hadn't come down. The city had survived. It was doing what cities did, patching, continuing, not forgetting, but not stopping either. "Then we need to use the time," he said. And they used the time. Cecil ran 3 evacuation rehearsals on the highest density zones. Robot completed the secondary relay analysis and identified 4 additional coordination nodes that had been established after the first network went dark, smaller, better concealed, almost certainly the architecture for the next campaign. Mark hit all 4 in a single night, moving fast alone, systematically. It took 6 hours and cost him a dislocated shoulder that he didn't mention to anyone. The round pink figure was not involved in the node strikes. Not because Mark didn't consider it. He considered it very briefly, and then he didn't, because he understood by then what the presence of people in active danger did to Kirby's navigation, and relay nodes in the middle of the night were empty of civilians, and therefore outside the set of things that triggered the response. Some things Mark had learned had to be done by people, not because the alternative was unavailable, but because the alternative came with something that shouldn't be treated as a mechanism. Nolan observed this without comment. Thrag came back in 4 weeks. Not with teams, not with an advance force. He came alone, which was its own message, and Nolan had been right about what that message meant. The test phase was done. The coordination architecture was gone. What Thrag was coming to do now did not require preparation or support or data collection. It required him. He came down at the edge of the cleared district in the pre-dawn dark. And the round pink figure was already at the perimeter, and Mark was 40 meters back, and Nolan was another 40 behind that, and Cecil had every surveillance asset pointing at this location, because there was nothing else worth watching anywhere on the planet tonight. Thrag looked at the small pink shape, then at Mark. "You destroyed the secondary network?" he said. "Alone." "Yes. Efficiently. I had time." Thrag looked back at the small figure. "You did that so it wouldn't have to. So it could remain what it is." Mark didn't answer. "I noticed," Thrag said. Then he moved. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds and established the terms of everything that followed. Thrag was moving at full commitment, not the measured pace of an assessment run, not the tactical restraint of someone collecting data. This was the Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire recovered from injuries that should have been fatal, fighting with the absolute resolve of a being who had turned survival into doctrine for 10,000 years. He went past Mark entirely on the first pass, straight toward the small pink figure, which had been waiting for it. The inhale caught Thrag mid-stride, not enough to stop him. Nothing stopped Thrag in that mode, but enough to strip the air from the leading edge of his momentum and pull him 4 degrees off his vector. 4 degrees over a distance of 15 meters was the difference between a strike that would have ended the fight immediately and a strike that clipped instead. The clip alone put a crater in the ground. The small figure had already relocated. It came back in from the left at a shallow angle, body fully extended at impact, and the force of that small round mass, moving at full velocity, connected with Thrag's ribs and bent him sideways by 6 inches and made a sound that Mark felt in his sternum. Thrag straightened. His expression didn't change. He had been hit harder. He had been hit by stronger things. What he hadn't encountered in whatever accounting he kept of his engagements was a thing that hit like that size, that fast, that wrong in terms of how physics was supposed to operate. He reached for it. It wasn't there. The fight took 47 minutes. Mark had not expected 47 minutes. He had expected something shorter, decisive, in one direction or the other, over before the sky got light. What he got instead was the most sustained thing he had ever witnessed. 2 bodies operating at the outer limit of what physics allowed, one of them built for exactly this, one of them built for something that nobody in this universe had ever required a blueprint for. Thrag adapted. That was what made him what he was, the capacity to update faster than most combatants could plan. He built a model of Kirby's pattern inside his own nervous system, adjusted for the inhale distances, compensated for the impact. Angles started to anticipate the drill vectors. Every time he anticipated correctly, the pattern changed. Not randomly. The pattern changed because the small figure was also updating. Also adjusting, also building a model, and its model was not of Thrag's fighting style. Its model was of where the harm was coming from, and what shape the harm had, and what shape the thing had to be to stop it. They were not learning the same lesson. Mark stayed on the flanks. He intercepted twice once when Thrag pulled his attention to use a piece of the district's infrastructure as a projectile once when a secondary Viltrumite unit arrived, and he dealt with that independently, so the main engagement didn't have to split. He pulled a civilian out of a structure that took collateral damage from a redirected impact. He held a perimeter. He did not decide the outcome. He was not supposed to decide the outcome. The end came at minute 43 in the interval between one exchange and the next. Thrag had landed a hit, a real one, the kind that left a mark even on something that moved the way Kirby moved. And he pressed the advantage in the way he always pressed advantages, immediately, decisively, without pausing to verify the damage. The verification was the trap. The small figure absorbed the follow-through and converted it. Not deflected, absorbed, and then used, and then added to in a chain that took less than 2 seconds and resulted in Thrag's full committed mass being redirected downward into the ground at an angle he had not chosen. The hammer connected on the way down. One impact. Concentrated. All of the accumulated force of 43 minutes applied to a single geometrically precise point. The ground gave way beneath Thrag for 2 meters. He did not get up. Mark stood at the edge of the crater and waited. Nothing moved. He waited another 30 seconds. Then he descended into the crater and checked what his earpiece couldn't tell him from a distance. He keyed the channel. "Cecil, I have the feed. He's dead." The line was quiet for a long moment. "Confirmed," Cecil said finally. "I'm pulling up the satellite data on remaining Viltrumite positioning. The command structure won't hold without him. There are succession protocols, but they'll take time. We have a window." "I know. We should discuss what to do with the window." "We will," Mark said. "Later." He climbed out of the crater and looked at the small pink shape which had settled on a broken section of the district perimeter and was watching the horizon with the same patient attention it always brought to everything. The battle marks had already cleared from its surface. It was exactly as it had been in the rubble of a disaster site several months ago when it had arrived without announcement and started pulling people out of wreckage. Exactly the same. 3 hours after the fight ended, the evacuation teams moved back into the secured districts. Medics ran the remaining triage. Construction crews got their first full, undisrupted access to the distribution corridor in 6 weeks and began assessment. The small pink figure worked alongside the recovery teams for most of the morning. It cleared debris from access routes. It located a structural pocket in the collapsed portion of the western residential block that the scanners had missed, and the 2 people inside it came out alive. It ate what was in the emergency ration distribution when the carts went out. All of it as usual. A medic attempted to document this and gave up. Mark sat on a piece of wall and watched it work. Nolan stood next to him for a while without speaking. Then, "Cecil's going to ask you about the succession window. Today, probably." "I know. What are you going to tell him?" Mark watched the small figure help a construction worker shift a load-bearing segment that would have required 2 people and a hydraulic jack. That the window exists because we broke the machine, not because we built a better one, and that the difference matters. Nolan was quiet for a moment. He'll say that's idealistic. He will. And I'll say that the last time we built a machine that ran on taking things from people who couldn't stop us, it ended with a pink round thing sitting in my city eating emergency rations. So maybe we don't do that again. Nolan almost smiled. It was a very small expression on a very large face, but it was there. The small pink figure finished with the western block before noon. It wandered through the recovery zone for a while after that. Not aimlessly, it never did anything aimlessly, but without the purpose of an active rescue or the locked posture of something tracking a distant signal. Just present, moving at the pace of the people around it, turning occasionally to look at something that had no apparent significance. At some point in the early afternoon, it stopped near the edge of the recovery zone, where the perimeter fence gave way to open land. It stood there for a while. Mark walked over. He didn't say anything. He just stood next to it and took in the same open land grassland, some trees, the city in the distance, doing the quiet work of continuing to exist. After a long moment, the small figure turned toward him. He held its gaze. Whatever it communicated in that exchange, it was brief and without ambiguity. And Mark understood it the same way he had come to understand most things about it, not through words and not through analysis, but through the accumulated weight of watching something be entirely what it was, consistently without apology across every situation that had tried to make it into something else. It turned back toward the open land. Then it began to walk. Mark watched it go. He could have called it back. He didn't. Cecil would have called it back. Robot would have flagged the departure as an unmanaged asset movement. Nolan might have let it go. Mark let it go. It walked until it was a small pink shape against the grass, and then it was a small pink shape against the horizon, and then it was not visible at all. Mark stood there for a while longer. The city was behind him. The recovery teams were behind him. The feed from Cecil's surveillance network was showing him 3 different camera angles of the departure, and he turned off the feed and put the earpiece in his pocket and stood in the quiet. Somewhere above the Viltrumite succession protocols were running. Somewhere in the far systems, the Empire was absorbing a fact it had not been required to absorb before. Somewhere ahead, there would be more conversations with Cecil about what to do with Windows, and what to do with power, and what to do with a world that had just survived something it barely understood. All of that was real. All of it would need to be handled. But first, he stood in the quiet for a while at the edge of a city that was still there on a planet that was still there in the wake of something that had come and done what it came to do, and not stayed to take credit for it. That was the whole of it.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.